Hey everyone, great to have you here. Before we dive in, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming analysis. Something is happening inside the most powerful military institution on Earth that almost nobody is talking about, and the silence itself tells you everything you need to know. The United States has the largest defense budget on the planet, more than $886 billion approved for fiscal year 2025 alone, and yet the people who spent their entire lives commanding that power are walking away or being pushed out faster than at any point in modern American history, and the ones who remain are keeping their heads down in a way that veterans and defense analysts describe as something they have never seen before. This is not a story about policy disagreements or budget fights or the usual friction between political administrations and career military brass. This is a story about a fundamental transformation happening inside the chain of command right now, and what it means for every single American. Whether you care about politics or not, think about what we are actually watching unfold. Over the last 14 months, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has fired or sidelined at least 24 generals and admirals, according to reporting by the New York Times. As of November 2025, that number includes some of the most decorated and respected officers in the entire military establishment. Among those removed were Air Force General C.Q. Brown, who served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral Lisa Franchetti, who commanded the entire United States Navy. These were not officers accused of misconduct. They were not officers who failed in combat. They were officers who did not demonstrate sufficient alignment with the political priorities of the current administration. Let that sink in for a moment, because what we are describing is not a purge of incompetent leaders. It is a purge of independent ones. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. Now, here is the question I want you to sit with right now, and I genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments below. Do you think it is ever acceptable for a president to remove military commanders based on political loyalty rather than performance? And what do you think happens to military effectiveness when that becomes the standard? Write your answer below, because this debate is real and it deserves to be heard. Let us go back to May 2025, because that is when the machinery of this transformation became fully visible. In a memo dated May 5th, Hegseth announced a plan to cut a minimum of 20% of all four-star generals and admirals across the active duty force. He also announced a 20% reduction in National Guard general officers and a 10% cut across all general and flag officer positions. That is roughly 900 positions at the one-star level and above across the entire American military being eliminated or restructured. To understand what that actually means, in human terms, imagine you are running a hospital and you fire 20% of your senior surgeons, not because they performed bad operations, but because they expressed concern about a new treatment protocol. Now every remaining surgeon knows exactly what happens to doctors who raise questions. The culture shifts overnight, not because anyone issued a policy saying be silent, but because the example was made publicly and repeatedly. That is the invisible mechanism at work here, and it does not appear in any budget line or recruitment statistic. The official framing from Washington is that this is about cutting bureaucracy and restoring warrior culture. The administration argues that the senior officer corps had become bloated, with leaders more focused on diversity initiatives and climate policy than on combat readiness. And that argument has genuine supporters inside and outside the military. There are real debates about whether the Pentagon had drifted from its core warfighting mission. There are legitimate questions about institutional bloat and promotion cultures that reward political navigation over battlefield competence. But here is where the story gets more complicated and more important. Multiple current and former senior officers speaking to outlets including the New York Times, Reuters, and Politico have described a culture inside the Pentagon that goes beyond cutting bureaucracy. They describe an atmosphere where raising operational concerns about decisions coming from the civilian leadership is now professionally dangerous, where the traditional back-channel mechanisms that allowed military professionals to push back on politically motivated decisions have been systematically dismantled. Politico reported in October 2025 that Hegseth's firing of a Navy official had compounded what sources inside the building described as a culture of fear. And this is not language that career military officers use lightly. These are people trained to run toward danger. People who have commanded forces in 3 and 4 combat theaters. People who do not reach for dramatic language as a default. When they use the phrase culture of fear, you should listen very carefully to what they're actually saying. And here is where the retired community enters the picture. Because the officers who are still in uniform are legally constrained from public political speech under Department of Defense regulations. But the ones who have left that world, those constraints fall away. And we are seeing something that has very few historical precedents in terms of its scale and its specificity. Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General James Mattis, who served as Trump's own Secretary of Defense, General Mark Milley, also former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral William McRaven, who commanded the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. These men have all spoken publicly about their concerns regarding the direction of military leadership under the current administration. And critically, they're not speaking as partisan operatives. They spent decades pointedly refusing to engage with partisan politics at all. The very thing that makes their voices extraordinary is the same thing that made their silence reliable for so long. When people who have spent 40 years avoiding public political statements decide that staying silent is no longer acceptable, you are not watching opportunism. You are watching a threshold moment, and understanding what pushed them past that threshold requires understanding what these men believe. Their entire careers were built around the American military tradition of civilian control is not just a legal formality. It is the foundational operating principle that separates the United States from the dozens of countries throughout history where military power and political power merged and produced catastrophe. Civilian control means that the elected government directs military policy. But it has always carried an implicit covenant in return, meaning that military decisions about operational readiness, troop safety, and combat deployment would be driven by strategic and security logic, not by who in the officer corps is willing to show up at political events. That covenant is what these generals say is being broken, and the specific mechanism through which they believe it is being broken is the personnel system itself. Here is how the machine actually works. When you control who gets promoted, who gets assigned to which commands, and who gets fired, you do not need to issue a single order telling officers to be loyal to a political agenda. You do not need to threaten anyone explicitly. You simply need to make the pattern of firings and promotions visible enough that every officer at the colonel and general level can calculate for themselves exactly what the new criteria are. And once that calculation happens, the culture transforms from the inside without a single written directive. This is the quiet catastrophe that defense analysts are watching in real time. and it is quiet precisely because the people most positioned to see it from the inside are the same people whose careers depend on not saying anything about it. Now we need to talk about something that almost never makes headlines, but which sits at the center of what is actually at stake here. The United States military's ability to deter adversaries and project credibility is not primarily a function of how many aircraft carriers we have or how large our defense budget is. It is a function of whether the world believes that American military decisions are driven by strategic logic rather than domestic political calculations. When China's military planners in Beijing assess whether the United States would actually respond to a Taiwan contingency, they're not just counting weapons. They're asking whether the American command structure operates with the kind of professional integrity that makes deterrence credible. When our NATO allies look at whether they can depend on American commitments, they are looking at the institutional culture of the Pentagon, not just at the text of treaty obligations. And this is where the story connects directly to every American's daily life in ways that might not be immediately obvious. If you have family members in the military, the question of whether their commanders are being selected based on competence and strategic judgment or based on political alignment is not an abstract constitutional debate. It is a question about whether the people making decisions that put your family members in or out of danger are the most capable people for that role or the most politically reliable. If you are paying federal taxes, you are funding an $886 billion defense establishment, and the question of whether the leadership of that establishment is being optimized for military effectiveness or for political loyalty is directly relevant to what you are getting for that investment. If you are thinking about the long-term security environment for your children and what kind of world they inherit, the credibility and integrity of American military institutions is not a background consideration. It is one of the primary load-bearing structures of the entire international order. Here is something I want to ask you directly, and I want you to drop your answer in the comments right now. Where are you watching this video from? And more importantly, do you feel like the mainstream news coverage of what is happening at the Pentagon is giving you the full picture? Or do you feel like something important is being left out? Tell me in the comments, because your perspective on this actually matters. Now let us look at the three scenarios that defense analysts and former senior officers are actually discussing, because they are not all equally bad, and the differences between them are significant. The first scenario is the one that supporters of the current approach would argue for. This is the view that what we are watching is a necessary and overdue correction, that the senior officer corps had genuinely become too politicized in one direction, too focused on social programs, and not enough on war fighting, and that the pain of the current transition is the price of restoring an institution that had drifted from its core mission. Under this scenario, the new promotion culture does produce a more combat-focused force, allies adjust to the new American posture, and the deterrence equation remains stable. The second scenario is the one that critics, including many of the retired generals who have spoken publicly, are most worried about. This is the scenario where the loss of experienced institutional knowledge combined with a promotion culture that selects for political alignment rather than independent judgment produces a military that is superficially loyal but operationally brittle. The danger in this scenario is not that it becomes visible immediately. The danger is that it only becomes visible at the moment of actual crisis, when a real confrontation emerges in the Taiwan Strait or in Eastern Europe, and the question of whether American deterrence is credible is tested in real time. The structural weaknesses created in the previous years becomes suddenly and catastrophically apparent. The third scenario is the one that almost no one is publicly discussing, but which the mathematics of institutions allows for. And that is the scenario where the scale and pace of the current transformation creates a genuine legitimacy crisis inside the officer corps itself, not a dramatic public rebellion, but a quiet exodus of exactly the officers who have the most options, the ones with the best records, the ones who would be most valuable in a real crisis are also the ones with the most ability to leave. They can retire, they can move to the private sector, they can find other ways to use their skills. The ones who stay under a politically driven promotion culture are disproportionately the ones who either share the political vision or who have calculated that staying and complying is the best path forward. And that is a selection mechanism that defense institutions historically have found very difficult to reverse once it is set in motion. The Congressional Budget Office projects that maintaining current defense commitments through 2028 requires not just the budget numbers, but the human capital of a professionally developed senior officer corps, built over decades and not replaceable on a short timeline. If that pipeline is disrupted, the $886 billion budget buys significantly less actual security than the headline number suggests. History offers us one reference point that everyone involved in this debate invokes, and it is worth taking seriously. In April 1951, President Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur for publicly defying presidential strategy. That moment is remembered as the definitive affirmation of civilian control over the military. But what is less discussed is what Truman did not do. He did not then remake the entire promotion system to select for political loyalty. He preserved the professional integrity of the officer corps while asserting the president's authority over strategy. The distinction matters because it tells us that civilian control and institutional professional independence are not opposites. They were designed to coexist, and the entire history of American civil-military relations is built on maintaining that balance. What we're watching today is a stress test of that balance conducted at a pace and scale that has no modern precedent. 37 four-star generals and admirals remained in the active duty force as of May 2025 before the reduction plan was announced. That number will shrink. The ones being replaced will be selected under new criteria, and the officers who will command American forces in whatever the next major crisis turns out to be are being shaped right now by what they are watching happen to the ones above them. The question is not whether civilian oversight of the military is legitimate. The question is whether the specific form that oversight is taking right now is producing a more effective military institution or a more politically compliant one. And if those two things are diverging, we need to understand that clearly before the moment when it actually matters. Because there will be a moment when it actually matters. There always is. The world does not schedule its crises around domestic political cycles. China is watching Taiwan. Russia is watching Europe. Adversaries everywhere are constantly recalculating whether the moment is favorable. And the single most important factor in their calculation is whether they believe that American military decisions would be made by people selected for their strategic competence and institutional integrity. So, here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely do not know the right answer to this, and I think that uncertainty is honest. Think carefully before you write it in the comments below. Is a military that is perfectly aligned with the elected civilian government, but selected for that alignment, more or less reliable as a deterrent than a military with independent professional culture that sometimes pushes back on civilian leadership. Which version of that institution actually keeps the peace, and which version of it makes the next crisis more likely? Write that answer below, because the people who are living inside this question right now, those generals and admirals and colonels who are watching their institution transform in real time, they're asking exactly the same question, and they are not sure of the answer either. Stay close to this story, because what is being decided inside the Pentagon right now will not announce itself with a single dramatic headline. It will reveal itself slowly through decisions made in crisis moments that none of us can predict and all of us will live with.